Croeso sianel Blaid Llwyd. Well, it's one of the spooky seasons for ghost stories, whether of course in Britain being Christmas. So I thought once again I'd dip into my own library, pick out another of M.R. James' classic stories. This time we're going to read Cast in the Runes. Dear Sir, I am requested by the Council of the Association to return to you the draft of paper on the truth of alchemy, which you have been good enough to offer to read at our forthcoming meeting, and to inform you that the Council do not see their way to including it in the programme. I am, yours faithfully, Secretary. Dear Sir, I am sorry to say my engagements do not permit of my affording you an interview on the subject of your proposed paper, nor do our laws allow your discussing the matter with a committee of our Council, as you suggest. Please allow me to assure you the fullest consideration was given to the draft which you submitted, and it was not declined without having been referred to the judgment of most competent authority. No personal question, it can hardly be necessary for me to add, can have had the slightest influence on the decision of the Council. Believe me, supra. The Secretary of the Association begs respectfully to inform Mr. Carswell that it is impossible for him to communicate the name of any person or persons to whom the draft of Mr. Carswell's paper may have been submitted, and further desires to intimate that he cannot undertake to reply to any further letters on the subject. And who is Mr. Carswell? Inquired the Secretary's wife. She had called at his office and, perhaps unwarrantably, had picked up the last of these 3 letters which the typist had just brought in. Why, my dear, just at present Mr. Carswell is a very angry man. I don't know much about him otherwise, except he's a person of wealth. His address is Lufford Abbey, Warwickshire, and he's an alchemist, apparently. Wants to tell us all about it. That's about all, except I don't want to meet him for the next week or 2. Now, if you're ready to leave this place, I am. What have you been doing to make him angry? Asked Mrs. Secretary. The usual thing, my dear, the usual thing. He sent in the draft of paper he wanted to read at the next meeting, and we referred it to Edward Dunning. Almost the only man in England who knows about these things. He said it was perfectly hopeless, so we declined it. Sir Carswell has been pelting me with letters ever since. The last thing he wanted was the name of the man referred his nonsense to. You saw my answer to that. But don't you say anything about it, for goodness sake. I should think not indeed. Did I ever do such a thing? I do hope, though, he won't get to know it's poor Mr. Dunning. Poor Mr. Dunning? I don't know why you call him that. He's a very happy man, is Dunning. Lots of hobbies and a comfortable home, and all his time to himself. Only meant I should be sorry for him if this man got hold of his name and came and bothered him. Yes, I dare say he would be, poor Mr. Dunning, then. The Secretary and his wife were lunching out, and the friends to whose house they were bound were Warwickshire people. So Mrs. Secretary had already settled it in her own mind she had questioned them judiciously about Mr. Carswell. But she saved the trouble of leading up to the subject. The hostess said to the host before many minutes had passed, I saw the Abbot of Lufford this morning. The host whistled. Did you? What in the world brings him up to town? Oh, goodness knows. He's come up the British Museum gate as I drove past. It was not unnatural that Mrs. Secretary should inquire whether this was the real abbot who was being spoken of. Oh, no, my dear. Only a native of ours in the country bought Lufford Abbey a few years ago. His real name is Carswell. Is he a friend of yours? Asked Mrs. Secretary with a private wink to his wife. The question let loose a torrent of declamation. There was really nothing to be said for Mr. Carswell. Nobody knew what he did with himself. His servants were a horrible set of people. He invented a new religion for himself, and practiced no one could tell what appalling rites. He was very easily offended and never forgave anybody. He had a dreadful face. So the lady insisted, her husband somewhat demurring. He never did a kind action. Whatever influence he did exert was mischievous. I do the poor man justice, dear, the husband interrupted. You forget the treat he gave to school children. Forget it, indeed. I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's an idea of the man. Now, Florence, listen to this. The first winter he was at Lufford, this delightful neighbour of ours wrote to the clergyman of his parish. He's not ours, but we know him very well. Often showed the school children some magic lantern slides. He said he had some new kinds, which he thought would interest them. Well, the clergyman was rather surprised. Mr. Carswell had shown himself inclined to be unpleasant to the children, complaining of their trespassing or something of the sort. Of course, he accepted, and the evening was fixed. Our friend went himself to see that everything went right. He said he'd never been so thankful for anything as his own children were all prevented from being there. There's a children's party at our house, as a matter of fact. Because this Mr. Carswell evidently set up the intention of frightening these poor village children out of their wits, and I do believe, if he'd been allowed to go on, he'd have actually done so. He began with some comparatively mild things. Red Riding Hood was one, and even then, Mr. Farrar said, the wolf was so dreadful that several of the smaller children had to be taken out. He said Mr. Carswell began the story by producing a noise like a wolf howling in the distance, which was the most gruesome thing he had ever heard. All the slides he showed, Mr. Farrar said, were most clever. They're absolutely realistic, and where he'd got them or how he worked them he could not imagine. Well, the show went on, and the stories kept on becoming a little more terrifying each time. The children were mesmerised in complete silence. Last, he produced a series which represented a little boy passing through his own park, a Lovett, in the evening. Every child in the room could recognise the place in the pictures. And this poor boy was followed, and at last pursued and overtaken, either torn in pieces or somehow made away with by a horrible hopping creature in white, which he first saw dodging about among the trees, and gradually it appeared more and more plainly. Mr. Farrar said it gave him one of the worst nightmares he ever remembered. What it must have meant to the children isn't worth thinking of. Of course, this was too much. He spoke very sharply indeed to Mr. Carswell and said it couldn't go on. All he said was, "Oh, you think it's time to bring our little show to an end and send them home to their beds? Very well." And then, if you please, he switched on another slide, which showed a great mass of snakes, centipedes, and disgusting creatures with wings, and some more he made it as if they were climbing out of the picture and getting in amongst the audience. This was accompanied by a sort of dry, rustling noise, which sent the children nearly mad, and of course they stampeded. A good many of them were rather hurt in getting out of the room, and I don't suppose one of them closed an eye that night. It was the most dreadful trouble in the village afterwards. Of course, the mothers threw a good part of the blame on poor Mr. Farrar. They got past the gates. I believe the fathers would have broken every window in the abbey. Well, no, that's Mr. Carswell. That's the Abbot of Lufford, my dear, and you can imagine how he covered his society. Yes, I think he has all the possibilities of a distinguished criminal, has Carswell, said the host. I should be told if anyone gets into his bad books. Is he the man, or mixed up with someone else? Asked the secretary, who for some minutes been wearing the frown of the man who's trying to recollect something. Is he the man who brought out a history of witchcraft some time back? 10 years or more? Yes, the man. Do you remember the reviews of it? Oh, certainly I do. It was exactly equally the point. I know the author the most incisive of the lot. So did you. You must remember John Harrington. He was at John's in our time. Oh, very well indeed. Though I don't think I heard or saw or heard anything of him between the time I went down and the day I read the account of the inquest on him. Inquest? Said one of the ladies. What has happened to him? Well, what happened? He fell over a tree and broke his neck. The puzzle was what could have induced him to get up there. It was a mysterious business, I must say. Here was this man, not an athletic fellow, was he? With no eccentric twist about him as ever noticed, walking home along a country road late in the evening, no tramps about, well known and liked in a place. And he suddenly begins to run like mad, loses his hat and stick, and finally shins up a tree, quite a difficult tree, growing in the hedgerow. A dead branch gives way and he comes down with it and breaks his neck, and there he found next morning with the most dreadful face of fear on him that could be imagined. It's pretty evident, of course, he'd been chased by something, and people talked of savage dogs and beasts escaped out of menageries. There's nothing to be made of that. That was in 89, I believe his brother Henry, who I remember as well at Cambridge, but you probably don't, been trying to get on the track for an explanation ever since. He, of course, insists there was malice in it. But I don't know. It's difficult to see how it could have come in. After a time, the talk reverted to the history of witchcraft. Did you ever look into it? Asked the host. Yes, I did, said the secretary. Went so far as to read it. It was as bad as it was made out to be? Oh, in point of style and form, quite hopeless. Deserved all the pulverizing it got. But besides that, it was an evil book. The man believed every word of what he was saying, and very much mistaken he hadn't tried the greater part of his receipts. Well, I remember Harrington's review of it. I must say if I'd been the author, it had quenched my literary ambition for good. I should never have held up my head again. Oh, it hasn't had that effect in the present case. But come, it's 3:30. I must be off. On the way home, the secretary's wife said, I do hope that horrible man won't find out that Mr. Dunny had anything to do with the rejection of his paper. I don't think there's much chance of that, said the secretary. Dunny won't mention himself. These matters are confidential. None of us will for the same reason. Carswell won't know his name, for Dunny hasn't published anything on the same subject yet. The only danger is that Carswell might find out. He's asked the British Museum people who's in the habit of consulting alchemical manuscripts. Can't very well tell them not to mention Dunny, can I? I'll just set them talking at once. Well, let's hope it won't occur to him. However, Mr. Carswell was an astute man. This much is in the way of prologue. On an evening rather later in the same week, Mr. Edward Dunning was returning from the British Museum, where he had been engaged in research, to the comfortable house in a suburb where he lived alone, tended by two excellent women who had long been with him. There is nothing to be added by way of description of him to what we have heard already. Let us follow him as he takes his sober course homewards. A train took him to within a mile or two of his house, and an electric tram a stage further. The line ended at a point some 300 yards from his front door. He'd had enough of reading when he got into the car. Indeed, the light was not such as to allow him to do more than study the advertisements on the panes of glass that faced him as he sat. As was not unnatural, the advertisements in this particular line of cars were objects of his frequent contemplation. And with the possible exception of the brilliant and convincing dialogue to Mr. Lamplugh and eminent K.C. on the subject of pyretic saline, none of them afforded much scope to his imagination. I am wrong. There was one at the corner of the car farthest from him which did not seem familiar. It was in blue letters on a yellow ground. All he could read of it was a name, John Harrington, and something like a date. It could be of no interest to him to know more. But for all that, as the car emptied, he was just curious enough to move along the seat until he could read it well. He felt to a slight extent repaid for his trouble. The advertisement was not of the usual type. It ran thus: In memory of John Harrington, FSA of the Laurels, Ashbrook. Died September 18th, 1889. 3 months were allowed. The car stopped. Mr. Dunning, still contemplating the blue letters on the yellow ground, had to be stimulated to rise by a word from the conductor. I beg your pardon, he said. Look at that advertisement. It's a very odd one, isn't it? The conductor read it slowly. Well, my word, he said. Never seen that one before. Well, that is a cure, ain't it? Someone been up their jokes here, I should think. He got out a duster and applied it, not without saliva, to the pane and then to the outside. No, he said, returning. That ain't no transfer. Seems to be it's regular in the glass. What I mean, in the substance, as you may say. Don't you think so, sir? Mr. Dunning examined it and rubbed it with his glove, and agreed. Who looks after these advertisements and gives leave them be put up? I wish you'd inquire. I will just take a note of the words. At this moment there came a call from the driver. Well, I've George, time's up. All right. There's something else what's up at this end. You come look at this here glass. What's going on with the glass? Said the driver, approaching. Well, who's Harrington? What's it all about? I was just asking who's responsible for the advertisements in your cars, and say it'd be as well to make some inquiry about this one. Well, sir, it's all down in the company's office, that work is. It's not Mr. Timms, I believe. Looks into that. Why you put up tonight, I'll leave word, and perhaps I'll be able to tell you tomorrow if you have to be coming this way. That was all that passed that evening. Mr. Dunning did just go to the trouble of looking up Ashbrook, and found it was in Warwickshire. Next day he went to town again. The car, if it was the same car, was too full in the morning to allow his getting a word of the conductor. He'd only be sure that the curious advertisement had been made away with. The close of the day brought a further element of mystery into the transaction. He had missed the tram, or else preferred walking home, but at a rather late hour was at work in his study, when the maids came to say that 2 men from the tramways was very anxious to speak to him. This was a reminder of the advertisement, which he had, he says, nearly forgotten. He had the men in, the conductor and driver of the car. When the matter of refreshment had been attended to, asked what Mr. Timms had to say about the advertisement. Well, sir, we took the liberty to step round about, said the conductor. Mr. Timms gave William here the rough side of his tongue about that. According to him, there wasn't no advertisement that description sent in, nor ordered, not paid for, not put up on, nothing, let alone me in there. We was playing the fool, taking him his time. Well, I says, that's the case. Or else you, Mr. Timms, I says, take a look at it for yourself. I says, of course it ain't there, I says. You may take and call me what you like. Right, he says, I will. And we went straight off. Now, I leave it to you, sir, if that lad, as we term with him with Harrington, weren't as plain as you think anything. Blow the letters on yellow glass, as I says at the time, and you bore me out regular in the glass, because if you remember, you recollected me swabbing it with my duster. Very sure I do, quite clearly. Well, you may say, well, I don't think Mr. Timms gets in the car with the light. No, he tell William to hold the light outside. Now, he says, where's your precious hand, what we heard so much about? Here it is, I says, Mr. Timms, and leave my hand on it. The conductor paused. Well, said Mr. Dunning, it was gone, I suppose, broken. Broke? Not it. They wanted you, believe me, no more trace of them letters. No letters they was on that piece of glass. Then, well, it's no good me talking. I never see such a thing. I used to William here if... But there, I says, what's the benefit of me going on about it? Now, what did Mr. Timms say? Why, he did what I gave him leave to. Cause pretty much anything you like. Don't say I blame him so much neither. What we thought, William and me did, was as you seen you take a bit of note about it. Well, that lettering. I certainly did that, and I have it now. Did you wish me to speak to Mr. Timms myself and show it to him? Well, is that what you came in about? There, didn't I say as much, said William. The other gentleman on a tracker one, that's my word. Now perhaps, George, allows I ain't taking very far wrong tonight. Very well, William, very well. Don't you go on to you as the frogs march me here. Come quiet, didn't I? Oh, same that we aren't talking time this way, sir. So happened you find time to step round the company's office in the morning. That Mr. Tim's what you see for yourself. We should lay under a very high obligation to you for the trouble. You see, Amy and Cole, well, one thing and another we mind. They go to their head of the office and think we seen things weren't there. Well, one thing's leads to another. Well, we should be at 12 months hence. Well, you can understand what I mean. Amid further elucidations of the proposition, George, conducted by William, left the room. The incredulity of Mr. Tim, sort of not in acquaintance with Mr. Dunning, was greatly modified on the following day by what the latter could tell and show him. Any bad mark that might have been attached to the names of William and George was not suffered to remain on the company's books. An explanation there was none. Mr. Dunning's interest in the matter was kept alive by an incident of the following afternoon. He was walking from his club to the train. He noticed some way ahead a man with a handful of leaflets that he had distributed to passers-by by agents of enterprising firms. This agent was not chosen a very crowded street for his operations. In fact, Mr. Dunning did not see him get rid of a single leaflet before he himself reached the spot. One was thrust into his hand as he passed. The hand that gave it touched his, and he experienced a sort of little shock as he did so. It seemed unnaturally rough and hot. He looked in passing at the giver. The impression he got was so unclear that, however much he tried to reckon up subsequently, nothing would come. He was walking quickly, and as he went, glanced at the paper. It was a blue one. The name of Harrington in large capitals caught his eye. He stopped, startled, and felt for his glasses. The next instant the leaflet was switched out of his hand by a man who hurried past. It was irrecoverably gone. He ran back a few paces, but where was the passer-by? Where the distributor? With a somewhat pensive frame of mind, Mr. Dunning passed on the following day in the select manuscript room of the British Museum, and filled up tickets for Harley 3586 and some other volumes. After a few minutes they were brought to him, and he set in the one he wanted first upon the desk. He thought he heard his own name whispered behind him. He turned round hastily, and in doing so brushed his little portfolio of loose papers onto the floor. He saw no one he recognised except one of the staff in charge of the room, who nodded to him and he proceeded to pick up his papers. He thought he had them all and was turning to begin work, when a stout gentleman at the table behind him, who was just rising to leave and to collect his own belongings, touched him on the shoulder, saying, "May I give you this? I think it should be yours," and handed him a missing quire. "It is mine, thank you," said Mr. Dunning. At the moment the man had left the room. Upon finishing his work for the afternoon, Mr. Dunning had some conversation with the assistant in charge, took occasion to ask who the stout gentleman was. "Oh, he's a man named Carswell," said the assistant. "He's asked me a week ago who are the great authorities in alchemy. Of course, I told him you're the only one in the country. I'll see if I can't catch him. He'd like to meet you, I'm sure." "Oh, for heaven's sake, don't dream of it," said Mr. Dunning, particularly anxious to avoid him. "Oh, very well," said the assistant. "He doesn't come here often. I dare say you won't meet him." More than once on the way home that day, Mr. Dunning confessed to himself that he did not look forward with his usual cheerfulness to a solitary evening. It seemed to him that something ill-defined and impalpable had stepped in between him and his fellow men, had taken him in charge, as it were. He wanted to sit close up to his neighbours in the train and the tram, but as luck would have it, both train and car were markedly empty. The conductor, George, was thoughtful, appeared to be absorbed in calculations of the number of passengers. On arriving at his house, he found Dr. Watson, his medical man, on his doorstep. "I've had to upset your household arrangements, I'm sorry to say, Dunning. Both your servants are hors de combat. In fact, I've had to send for the nursing home." "Good heavens, what's the matter?" "Oh, it's something like ptomaine poisoning, I should think. You're not suffered yourself, I can see. You wouldn't be walking about. Well, I think they'll pull through all right." "Dear, dear. Can you hear what brought it on?" "Well, they tell me they bought some shellfish from a hawker at their dinner time. It's odd. I made inquiries, but I can't find any hawkers been to other houses in the street. I couldn't send word to you. They won't be back for a bit yet. You're coming down with me tonight anyhow. We can make arrangements for going on. 8 o'clock. Don't be too anxious." The solitary evening was thus obviated, at the expense of some distress and inconvenience, it is true. Mr. Dunning spent the time pleasantly enough with the doctor, a rather recent settler, and returned to his lonely home about 11:30. The night he passed is not one on which he looks back with any satisfaction. He was in bed and the light was out. He was wondering if the charwoman would come early enough to get him hot water next morning, when he heard the unmistakable sound of his study door opening. No step followed it on the passage floor. The sound must mean mischief, for he knew that he had shut the door that evening after putting his papers away in his desk. It was rather shame than courage induced him to slip out in the passage and lean over the banister in his nightgown, listening. No light was visible. No further sound came. Only a gust of warm or even hot air played for an instant round his shins. He went back and decided to lock himself into his room. There was more unpleasantness, however. Either an economical suburban company decided their light would not be required in the small hours and had stopped working, or something else was wrong with the meter. The effect was in any case the electric light was off. The obvious course was to find a match and also to consult his watch. He might as well know how many hours of discomfort awaited him. So he put his hand into the well-known nook under the pillow. Only it did not get so far. What he touched was, according to his account, a mouth, with teeth and with hair about it, and, he declares, not the mouth of a human being. I don't think there's any use to guess what he said or did, but he's in a spare room with the door locked in his ear to it, for he's clearly conscious again. There he spent the rest of a most miserable night, looking every moment for some fumbling at the door. Nothing came. The venturing back to his own room in the morning was attended with many listenings and quiverings. The door stood open, fortunately, and the blinds were up. The servants had been out of the house before the hour of drawing them down. There was, to be short, no trace of an inhabitant. The watch, too, was in its usual place. Nothing was disturbed, only the wardrobe door had swung open in accordance with his confirmed habit. A ring at the back door now announced a charwoman, who had been ordered the night before, unnerved Mr. Dunning, after letting her in, to continue his search in other parts of the house. It was equally fruitless. The day thus begun went on dismally enough. He dared not go to the museum, in spite of what the assistant had said. Carswell might turn up there, and Dunning felt he could not cope with a probably hostile stranger. His own house was odious. He hated sponging on the doctor. He spent some little time in the court of the nursing home, where he was slightly cheated by a good report of his housekeeper and maid. Towards lunchtime he betook himself to his club, again experiencing a gleam of satisfaction at seeing the secretary of the association. At luncheon Dunning told his friend the more material of his woes, but could not bring himself to speak of those that weighed most heavily on his spirits. "My poor dear man," said the secretary. "What an upset. Look here, we're alone at home, absolutely. You must put up with us. Yes, no excuse and change your things this afternoon." Dunning was able to stand out. He was in truth becoming acutely anxious as the hours went on as to what might have been waiting for him. He was almost happy as he hurried home to pack up. His friends, when they had time to take stock of him, were rather shocked at his lorn appearance. They did their best to keep him up to the mark. Not altogether without success. When the two men were smoking alone later, Dunning became dull again. Suddenly he said, "Gayton, I believe that alchemist man knows who got his paper rejected." Gayton whistled. "Why should you think that?" he said. Dunning told of his conversation with the museum assistant, and Gayton grumblingly agreed the guess seemed likely to be correct. "Not that I care much," Dunning went on. "Only it might be a nuisance for you to meet. It's a bad-tempered party, I imagine." Conversation dropped again. Gayton became more and more strongly impressed with the desolateness that came over Dunning's face and bearing, and finally, though with considerable effort, he asked him point-blank whether something serious was not bothering him. Dunning gave an exclamation of relief. "I was perishing to get it off my mind," he said. "Do you know anything about a man named John Harrington?" Gayton was thoroughly startled. The man could only ask why. Then the complete story of Dunning's experiences came out. What happened in the tramcar, in his own house and in the street, the troubling of spirit that crept over him and still held him, the end of the question he had begun with. Gayton was at a loss how to answer him. Tell the story of Harrington's end would perhaps be right, only Dunning was in a nervous state. The story was a grim one. He could not help asking himself whether there were not a connecting link between these two cases and the person of Carswell. It was a difficult concession for a scientific man, but it could be eased by the phrase hypnotic suggestion. In the end, he decided his answer tonight should be guarded. He would talk the situation over with his wife. So he said he'd known Harrington at Cambridge and believed he had died suddenly in 1889, adding a few details about the man in his published work. He did talk over the matter with Mrs. Gayton, and, as he'd anticipated, she'd have at once the conclusion which had been hovering before him. It was she who reminded him of the surviving brother, Henry Harrington, and she also who suggested he might be got hold of by means of their hosts the day before. "He might be a hopeless crank," objected Gayton. "That could be ascertained from the Bennets who knew him," Mrs. Gayton retorted, and she undertook to see the Bennets the very next day. It is not necessary to tell in further detail steps at which Henry Harrington and Dunning were brought together. The next scene that does require to be narrated is the conversation that took place between the two. Dunning told Harrington of the strange ways in which the dead man's name had been brought before him, and had said something besides of his own subsequent experiences. Then he had asked if Harrington was disposed, in return, to recall any of the circumstances concerned with his brother's death. Harrington's surprise at what he heard can be imagined, but his reply was readily given. John, he said, in a very odd state, undeniably from time to time during some weeks before, though not immediately before the catastrophe. There were several things. The principal notion was that he had thought he was being followed. No doubt he was an impressionable man. He never had such fancies as this before. I cannot get out of my mind there was ill will at work. And what you tell me about yourself reminds me very much of my brother. Can you think of any possible connecting link? It's just one been taking shape vaguely in my mind. Have you told your brother reviewed a book very severely not long before he died? Just lately I've happened to cross the path of the man who wrote that book in a way he would resent. Don't tell me the man is called Carswell. Why not? That's exactly his name. Henry Harrington leant back. That's final to my mind. Now I must explain further. From something you said, I feel sure that my brother John was beginning to believe, very much against his will, that Carswell was at the bottom of his trouble. I want to tell you what seems to me to have a bearing on this situation. My brother was a great musician, used to run for concerts in town. He came back 3 months before he died for one of these, and gave me his programme to look at. An analytical programme. He always kept them. I nearly missed this one, he said. Suppose I had dropped it. And I was looking under my seat in my pockets and so on, and my neighbour offered me his. Said he might give it to me as he had no further use for it, and just went away afterwards. Don't know who he was, a stout, clean-shaven man. I've been sorry to miss it, of course. I could have bought another, but this cost me nothing. Another time he told me he'd been very comfortable both on the way to his hotel and during the night. I piece things together now in thinking it over. And not very long after, he's going over these programmes, putting them in order to have them bound up. A particular one, which by the way I'd hardly glanced at, he found quite near the beginning a strip of paper with some very odd writing on it in red and black. Most carefully done. Looked to me more like runic letters than anything else. Why, he said, it's maybe belonged to my fat neighbour. So it might be worth returning to him. Maybe a copy of something. Evidently someone has taken trouble over it. I couldn't find his address. We talked it over for a little. Really wasn't worth advertising about. And my brother had better look out for the man at the next concert, to which he was going very soon. The paper was lying on the book, and we were both by the fire. It was a cold, windy summer evening. I suppose the door blew open. I didn't notice it. At any rate, a gust, a warm gust it was, came quite suddenly between us, took the paper and blew it straight into the fire. It was light, thin paper, and fairly went up the chimney in a single ash. Well, I said, you can't give it back now. He said nothing for a minute, and rather crossly, no, I can't. Why you should keep on saying so, I don't know. I remarked I didn't say it more than once. Not more 4 times, you mean? That's all he said. And all that very clearly, for any good reason. And now to come to the point. I know if you looked at that book of Carswell's which my unfortunate brother reviewed. It's not likely you should, but I did, both before his death and after it. First time we made a game of it together. It's written in no style at all. Split infinitives and every sort of thing that makes an Oxford gorge your eyes. There's nothing that the man didn't swallow, except classical myths and stories out of the Golden Legend and reports of savage customs of today. All very proper, no doubt, if you know how to use them, but he didn't. Didn't put the Golden Legend and the Golden Bough exactly on a par, as I believe both. A pitiable exhibition, in short. Well, after the misfortune, I looked over the book again. It's no better than before. The impression which I left on this time on mind was different. I suspected, as I told you, that Carswell had borne ill will to my brother, even that he was in some way responsible for what had happened. And now his book seemed to me to be a very sinister performance indeed. One chapter in particular struck me, when she spoke of casting the runes on people, either the purpose of gaining their affection or getting them out of the way, perhaps more especially the latter. Spoke of all this in a way that really seemed to me to imply actual knowledge. I had not time to go into details. Just that I'm pretty sure from information received that the civil man of contact was Carswell. I more than suspect, my paper was the importance. I do believe if my brother had been able to give it back, he might have been alive now. Therefore it occurs to me to ask you if there anything to put beside what I've told you. By way of answer, Dunning had the episode in the manuscript room in the British Museum to relate. And did actually hand you some papers. Examine them. No, so we must, if you'll allow it, look at them at once, and very carefully. They went to the still empty house, empty if the 2 servants were not yet able to return to work. Dunning's portfolio of papers was gathering dust on the writing table. In it were the quires of small-sized scribbling paper which he used for his transcripts. One of these, as he took it up, there slipped and fluttered out in the room with uncanny quickness, a strip of thin, light paper. The window was open, but Harrington slammed it to just in time to intercept the paper which he caught. I thought so, he said. Might be the identical thing that's given to my brother. You'll have to look out, Dunning. This may mean something quite serious for you. A long consultation took place. The paper was narrowly examined. As Harrington had said, the characters on it were more like runes than anything else, not decipherable by either man, and both hesitated to copy them for fear, as they confessed, of perpetuating what evil purpose they might conceal. So it remained impossible, if I may anticipate a little, to ascertain what was conveyed in this curious message or commission. Both Dunning and Harrington are firmly convinced it had the effect to bring its possessors into very undesirable company. That it must be returned to the source whence it came, they were agreed, and further the only safe and certain way was that of personal service, and here contrivance would be necessary, for Dunning was known by sight to Carswell. He must, for one thing, alter his appearance by shaving his beard. But then might not the blow fall first? Harrington thought they could time it. He knew the date of the concert at which the black spot had been put on his brother. It was June 18th. The death had followed on September 18th. Dunning reminded him that 3 months had been mentioned on the inscription on the car window. Perhaps, he added with a cheerless laugh, mine may be a bill at 3 months too. I wonder if I can fix it on my diary. Yes, April 23rd is the date at the museum. That brings us to July 23rd. Now, you know, it becomes extremely important to me to know anything you feel tell me about the progress of your brother's trouble, if it's possible you to speak of it. Of course. Well, the sense of being watched whenever he was alone was the most distressing thing to him. After a time, he took to sleeping in his room, and he was better for that. Still, he talked a great deal in his sleep. What about? Is it wise to dwell on that, at least before things are straightened out? I think not. I can tell you this. 2 things came to him by post during those weeks, both a London postmark, addressed in a commercial hand. One was a woodcut at Berwick's, roughly drawn of the page, one which shows a moonlit road and a man walking along it, followed by an awful demon creature. Under it were written the lines of the Ancient Mariner, which I suppose the cut illustrates, about one who, having once looked round, walks on and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend that close behind him tread. The other was a calendar, such as tradesmen often sent. My brother had paid no attention to this. I looked at it after his death, and everything after September 18th had been torn out. Maybe surprised he hadn't gone out alone even he was killed. The fact is that during the last 10 days or so of his life, he'd been quite free of the sense of being followed or watched. The end of the consultation was this. Harrington, who knew a neighbour of Carswell's, thought he saw a way of keeping a watch on his movements. It would be done in part to be in readiness to try to cross Carswell's path at any moment, to keep the paper safe in a place of ready access. We parted. The next weeks were no doubt a severe strain upon Dunning's nerves. The intangible barrier which had seemed to rise about him on the day when he received the paper gradually developed into a brooding blackness that cut him off the means of escape to which one might have thought he might resort. No one was at hand who was likely to suggest them to him, and he seemed robbed of all initiative. He waited with inexpressible anxiety as May, June, and early July passed on for a mandate from Harrington. For all this time, Carswell remained immovable at Lufford. At last, in less than a week before the date he had come to look upon as the end of his early activities, came a telegram. Leaves Victoria by boat train Thursday night. Do not miss. I come to you tonight. Harrington. He arrived accordingly to concocted plans. The train left Victoria at 9. Its last stop before Dover was Croydon West. Harrington would mark down Carswell at Victoria and look over Dunning at Croydon, calling to him if need were by name agreed upon. Dunning, disguised as far as might be, was to have no label or initials or any hand luggage, and must at all costs have the paper with him. Dunning in suspense, he waited on the Croydon platform I need not attempt to describe. His sense of danger in the last days had only been sharpened by the fact that the cloud about him had perceptibly been lighter. Relief was an ominous symptom, and if Carswell eluded him now, hope was gone, and there were so many chances of that. The ruin of their journey might itself be a device. The 20 minutes in which he paced the platform persecuted every report of inquiries about the boat train was bitter as any he'd spent. Still, the train came and Harrington was at the window. It was important, of course, there should be no recognition, so Dunning got in at the further end of the corridor carriage, while he gradually made his way to the compartment where Harrington and Carswell were. He was pleased, on the whole, to see that the train was far from full. Carswell was on the alert, but gave no sign of recognition. Dunning took the seat not immediately facing him, attempted, vainly at first, and with increasing command of his faculties, to reckon the possibilities of making the desired transfer. Opposite to Carswell and next to Dunning was a heap of Carswell's coats on the seat. It was no use to slip the paper into these. He would not be safe, or not feel so, since someone could be profited by him and accepted by the other. There was a handbag, open and with papers in it. Could he manage to conceal this? Or perhaps Carswell might leave the carriage without it, then find and give it to him? This was the plan that suggested itself. If only he could have counselled with Harrington. But that could not be. The minutes went on. More than once Carswell rose and went out into the corridor. The second time Dunning was on the point of attempting to make the bag fall off the seat, but he caught Harrington's eye and read in it a warning. Carswell, from the corridor, was watching, probably to see if the two men recognised each other. He returned and was evidently restless, and when he rose the third time hope dawned. Something did slip off his seat and fall with hardly a sound to the floor. Carswell went out once more, about out of range of the corridor window. Dunning picked up what had fallen and saw the key was in his hands in the form of one of Cook's ticket cases with tickets in it. These cases have a pocket in the cover. Within very few seconds the paper of which we had heard was in the pocket of this one. To make the operation more secure, Harrington stood in the doorway of the compartment and fiddled with the blind. It was done, and done at the right time. The train was now slowing down towards Dover. In a moment more Carswell re-entered the compartment. As he did so, Dunning, managing he knew not how, to suppress the tremble in his voice, handed him the ticket case, saying, "May I give you this, sir? I believe it is yours." After a brief glance at the ticket inside, Carswell uttered the hopeful response, "Yes, it is. Much obliged you, sir." And he placed it in his breast pocket. Even in the few moments that remained, moments of tense anxiety, they knew not what a premature finding the paper might lead. Both men noticed the carriage seemed to darken about them and to grow warmer. The Carswell was fidgety and oppressed. They drew a heap of loose coats near to him and cast it back till it repelled him, and as he sat upright and glanced anxiously at both. They, with sickening anxiety, busied themselves in collecting their belongings. They both thought Carswell was on the point of speaking when the train stopped at Dover town. It was natural in the short space between town and pier they should both go into the corridor. At the pier they got out, but so empty was their train they were forced to linger on the platform until Carswell should have passed ahead of them with his porter on the way to the boat. Only then was it safe for them to exchange a pressure of the hand and a word of concentrated congratulation. The effect upon Dunning was to make him almost faint. Harrington made him lean up against the wall, while he himself went forward a few yards in sight of the gangway to the boat, which Carswell had now arrived. The man at the head of it examined his ticket, and, laden with coats, he passed down to the boat. Suddenly the official called after him, "Hey, sir, beg your pardon. Did the other gentleman show his ticket?" "What the devil do you mean by the other gentleman?" Carswell's snarling voice called back from the deck. The man bent over and looked at him. "Neville? Well, I don't know, I'm sure." Harrington heard him say to himself then aloud, "My mistake, sir, it must have been your rugs. I ask your pardon." Then to a subordinate near him, "Had he got a dog with him or what? Funny thing, I swore he weren't alone." "Oh, whatever it is, I'll have to see her aboard. She's off now." "Oh, another way to forget the holiday customers." In 5 minutes more there was nothing but lessening lights of the boat, the long line of the Dover lamps, the night breeze, and the moon. Long and long the two sat in their room at the Lord Warden. In spite of the removal of their greatest anxiety, they were oppressed with the doubt, not of the lightest. Had they been justified in sending a man to his death as they believed they had? Ought they not to warn him at least? "No," said Harrington. "If he's the murderer, I think, and we've done more than is just. Still, if you think it's better. But how and where can you warn him?" "I spoke to Abbeville only," said Dunning. "I saw that. But one of the hotels there in Joanne's guide. Examine your ticket case, Dunning. I should feel happier. This is the 21st of a day. I'm afraid he's gone into the dark." So telegrams were left at the hotel office. It's not clear whether he's reached their destination, or whether, if they did, they were understood. All that is known is that, on the afternoon of the 23rd, an English traveller examining the front of St. Wolfram's Church at Abbeville, then under extensive repair, was struck on the head and instantly killed by a stone falling from the scaffold erected around the northwestern tower, there being, as was clearly proved, no workman on the scaffold at the moment, and the traveller's papers identified him as Mr. Carswell. Only one detail shall be added. At Carswell's sale, a set of Berwick, sold with all faults, was acquired by Harrington. The page with the woodcut of the traveller and the demon was, as it expected, mutilated. Also, after a judicious interval, Harrington repeated to Dunning something what he heard his brother say in his sleep. But it was not long before Dunning stopped him. Dating from around 1904 or so, I think it was. That was Cast in the Runes. So, hope you enjoyed this little extra Halloween special. I might do another ghost story around Christmas time. A little British tradition thanks to Charles Dickens. But always, before I go, I'd like to say thanks to all my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon, and a special mention to all my top patrons: Kajit Cook, Andy Peng, Mohammed Al-Zamil, Aaron Fox, Exak, Monolay, Evan King, Marcus, Sindri Dragowolf, Kopi, Spiderling, Grizz, Dissonance, Anubis Silverwind, Ida Corval, Tiger Cub, Brian Hall, Bastion, Lark Heskitten, Besuksu, Cobus Vissa, Kartek, and Burnt Toast. So we'll be back on the weekend with yet another VN. Back to normal service then. Until then, thanks for listening. Bye for now.